One of the things that always makes a good revolutionary is if you know what it is you're rebelling against. And many of the great musical revolutionaries not only were fully cognizant of the traditions that had preceded them, but in many cases were actually practitioners of those traditions themselves. And it's often forgotten that Igor Stravinsky started out his musical life as a very dogged Russian Romantic traditionalist. People tend to think of him as the great revolutionary who shocked the musical world with a Rite of Spring in 1913. But his principal composition teacher was Rimsky-Korsakov, who, while by no means a backward-thinking composer, nonetheless was an outgrowth of Russian nationalism and Romanticism. And there are some early works of Stravinsky which one can find and listen to. For example, his Opus 1, the Symphony in E-flat, which sounds like a very respectable conservatory piece by maybe young Alexander Glazunov or something. I don't play it well, but the last mood goes something like this. That does not sound like somebody who's going to evoke a riot with his ballet, The Rite of Spring, a few years later. But Stravinsky was given several chances to prove himself in a very competitive musical arena. His music had attracted the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, the director of the Ballet Russe, and Diaghilev was in desperate need of a composer to compose the music for a ballet based on an old Russian folk tale, the tale of the Firebird. And he had in fact given the commission to another Russian composer, Anatol Lyadov, even though he'd been warned that Lyadov tended to be a little bit lazy, didn't quite get the job done on time, if at all, in many instances. And when Diaghilev had not heard from Lyadov for quite some time, he came knocking at his door several months in advance of the premiere and said, "How's the composition of the Firebird going?" And Lyadov said, "Oh, it's going very well. See, I just went to the music store. See all the music paper I bought?" And so he and Diaghilev came to an amicable parting of the ways, and Diaghilev took a chance on the young Stravinsky, who had never written anything large-scale in his life, with the exception of that E-flat symphony. And the score that Stravinsky turned out in record time was nothing short of amazing. Debussy and Ravel both marveled at it. People were talking about it for weeks and months afterwards. It really was an impressive debut. For me, while it is certainly a very modern piece, and certainly it makes use of many modern devices, some of the strange effects in the violins where they're sliding up and down in the strings, making this eerie whistling effect, as is but one example. It is nonetheless a work that's heavily steeped in Russian folk song and in traditional Russian music. There are several folk tunes of which Stravinsky makes use, particularly in the last section, that beautiful horn solo. But then just to show what a young modernist he is, Stravinsky takes that same tune and he casts it in 7 beats per bar. So right away he's saying, yes, I'm taking traditional material, but I'm having my way with it. And those irregular rhythms, such as 7, are exactly the kinds of things that he would explore with more and more complexity in Petrushka and eventually The Rite of Spring. There's also a part, I've mentioned this to several conducting friends, and they all kind of go, oh yeah. It's the infernal dance, the very, very famous dance of the villain, which goes. So here's this very angular tune, mostly in offbeats. Ba, be, ba, 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 ba. It's not widely remembered that Stravinsky was a big fan of Tchaikovsky. He quite idolized him. As a matter of fact, when Stravinsky started conducting more and more and getting asked to appear with different orchestras as a guest conductor, and he didn't always want to do his own music, and he found a little niche for himself by performing the first 3 symphonies of Tchaikovsky, which at that time, 1920s, 1930s, were not widely known. So he made quite a splash for himself as a Tchaikovsky interpreter. And I know that there are a lot of people who are pretty diehard modernists who bristle at the mere thought of Tchaikovsky. I'm thinking of, what is that nasty quote from Pierre Boulez? "I hate Tchaikovsky and I will not conduct him, but if the public wants him, they can have him." But here is Stravinsky, again, shocking the world with the modernness of so much of what he wrote, who really loved Tchaikovsky and what he'd accomplished. Anyway, thinking of this, I can't help thinking of that dance in Act 1 of The Nutcracker. Doesn't that sound a little... I do detect a family resemblance there. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I do think that there is a little shred of Tchaikovsky-Stravinsky symbiosis going on at that moment. Stravinsky once said that he couldn't begin to compose a piece of music until he had decided which problem he was going to solve. And this apparently applied even to the cases in which he wrote music for young persons. Like many another 20th century composer, he wrote some pieces for young pianists to play, but in no way curtailed his creativity, his ability to communicate, his ability to write music of great beauty and elegance. And I think, was it Kodály? Was it Zoltán Kodály who once said, no composer is too great to write music for children, and in fact, he should be great enough to write it. And Stravinsky must have believed in that dictum as well, because he, in the several pieces that he wrote for kids to play, he achieved some marvelous results. And he wrote a little suite for children called Les Cinq Doigts, the 5 fingers, and at the head of each piece, he showed that one of the hands would be set in one position and wouldn't deviate from that position for the entirety of that particular movement. So you'd think that that would be a limitation. What he's saying, in effect, is the melody is going to be limited to just these 5 notes. But look at the beauty that he achieves in the first of these 8 pieces. Isn't that adorable? There's another one here. It's a march. I don't know if I'm quite up to playing it, but I'm going to make a stab at it. Let's see. Again, right hand, same position from which it does not move, but this is what Stravinsky gets. So, the reason I'm playing these pieces, in addition to the fact that I love them, is that much later, many decades after he'd written this little suite for children, Stravinsky was asked to write a piece for the Monday Evening Concerts series at the Los Angeles County Art Museum. And he took a look backwards and took this little suite of 8 pieces and arranged them in a new version called 8 Instrumental Miniatures for 15 players. And it's this little suite with which we're going to open the second half of this concert. It's an all Stravinsky second half. It's the 8 instrumental miniatures, the Firebird suite at the end, and sandwiched in between another lesser-known work by Stravinsky, a piece called Symphonies of Wind Instruments, a work that features just the winds and brass of the orchestra. And Stravinsky didn't mean that this was a series of little 4-movement symphonies, such as we know the term, rather that symphonies was used in the sense of instruments sounding together. And it's a very, very poignant piece, particularly when you know that he wrote it to the memory of Claude Debussy, whom he loved and admired very greatly. The piece starts out in a rather acerbic way and then ends up in what I can only describe as a very heartfelt chorale, obviously wearing his heart very much on his sleeve in memory of his dear departed friend and colleague.